السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نيابة عن المركز الوطني للتعليم الإلكتروني، نرحب بكل من انضم معنا في هذه الندوة بعنوان منصة تجربة التعلم LXP أو نظام إدارة التعلم LMS، المزايا والتحديات. وأسعد أنا زيد بن علي الرقيب بتقديمها لكم من عاصمة المملكة العربية السعودية الرياض. نحيطكم علما بأن الترجمة الفورية متاحة باللغة العربية لهذه الجلسة. الرجاء الضغط على أيقونة الترجمة في أسفل الشاشة. Greetings from the city of Riyadh, the capital of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I'm Zaid Al-Raqib. On behalf of the National E-Learning Center, we welcome you all to this webinar on Learning Experience Platform, LXP, or Learning Management System, LMS, Features and Challenges. It is with great privilege that we welcome Dr. Alan Bruce, CEO of Universal Learning Systems and Senior Fellow at the European Distance and E-Learning Network, who will be the host for this session. We also welcome the distinguished panelists, Dr. Teemu Patala, Director and Co-founder of Context Learning Finland, Mr. Keith Quinn, Digital Learning Design and Learning and Development Consultant, and founder of Random Access Learning. We would like to thank these distinguished speakers for joining us today. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to the host, Dr. Bruce.
Thank you very much, Zaid, and you might facilitate me as well with the PowerPoint slides that I can guide people through for this discussion. But first and foremost, I would like to say welcome to all our participants. And I would like to express my own personal thanks to the team at the National E-Learning Center in Saudi Arabia for the invitation to hold this webinar and to make it an international webinar on a rather critical subject, and again, at the cutting edge of things that are happening within our field as educators, as administrators, as academics, or people working in the corporate sector. When we look at what we want to achieve today, it is an exploration and it is a discussion. We want to look at the emergence of LXP and the features it has and the characteristics it has. We want to contrast this with situations in the past, and we want to be able to extract from this the implications for our own work. So to do this, we're not going to ask you all to sit down and just listen to a series of statements, but we're going to have expert insights, expert views, so that you will be able to judge the experience, the themes, and the issues that have been emerging in this field, and be able to formulate the questions about how important this is. I think as an outset, the first thing I would say in hosting this is that LXP against LMS indicates a couple of key generic themes. The first thing is the change that is occurring around us. And this change is rapid, it is daily in terms of the structure of education, the dimensions of education, and the dimensions of learning. The second thing, of course, and central to our discussion today, is the issue of technology and how the technology interweaves with that change process to be able to produce new and unexpected results and things that are still emerging in many wonderful and exciting ways. And the third thing, of course, we've touched on is this question of international. This is a globalized process, and this is where information and insights can be exchanged very rapidly over time, over space. There are no borders to our discussion. And we wanted those themes to kind of shape what we do today in our work with you. The way this will be structured is, after my introductory comments here, is that we will hand over to our first expert, Teemu Patala. Teemu is based in Finland. We've worked together for many years in many different environments. And Finland itself is a country which has exemplified the rapid change, the use of technology, the question of very advanced learning systems. I won't mention its continued success in PISA, but to show that the question of educational innovation is centrally connected with a coherent understanding of policy, of content, and of dynamism in getting that content across to learners and to the people who shape learning. Teemu will give us a general background for what has been emerging with LXP and its predecessor with LMSs, and try and set a context for us to understand what this means. In this first session, we will be looking primarily at the corporate and adult learning sector, but there is another dimension which we will come to in later sessions. Following Teemu's presentation, we shall go to Keith Quinn in Scotland. And again, Keith's record over many years is an exemplary one of being able to design, shape, and create learning systems in very large organizations, being able to cascade out this learning to workers at a whole series of different points of reception, to break away from traditional understandings and to be able to provide the technology to enable people to learn at their own pace, in their own place. And I think much of what Keith has to say to us is a glimpse not just of his wonderful track record in the past, but of the future which is facing all of us. And I think there's a richness of experience there that will make the points we're considering in general become real. And I think this is a great contribution that Keith will be able to bring to us. So we have Finland, we have Scotland, and I might as well just mention myself in the introductory remarks. And thank you, Zaid. It was mentioned that I am Director of Universal Learning Systems. And again, this might be a symbol of the things that are changing around us. This is an Irish company. I am Irish, but I grew up in the United States, and I currently live in Spain. So I think this is kind of the things we talk about. I work all over Europe, and we work in many other environments in Palestine, in Jordan, in China, in the United States, continuing, pushing out the frontiers of education, of learning design. And with this, shaping technology to meet the huge human needs that we all have, and these are significant ones. I'm delighted to be your host today. I'm delighted to be able to try and hold this together in terms of our presentation and how we want to be able to get across points. And more importantly, there's you, the participants coming into this webinar, that you will be able to derive benefit, listen to the examples that are set before you, and please be able to form questions that are meaningful for you. We're hoping after the presentations, which will last a certain amount of time, we have altogether an hour and a half to play with. And we are hoping at the end of the presentations from Teemu and Keith to have questions. We have some initial questions we would like to throw to them to be able to discuss, but that you yourselves will formulate questions or contributions to make this webinar a rich and dynamic experience as we approach the whole question of LXP and what it means. This is a time of significant change. There are many, many initiatives out there. And NELC, for example, has been involved with FutureX. There are some wonderful initiatives like this that give us a foundation. And we want to look across the spectrum of initiatives to see where this is going, but to do that, where have we come from? So within this discussion, listen and contribute, and we hope that this will be a pleasurable experience for all of you. So if I could turn to our first contributor, Teemu Patala. Teemu, would you like to start off and give us your words of wisdom and your experience, and it'll be a pleasure to hear you.
Excellent. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Sid, and thank you for the excellent team at National E-Learning Center for inviting me to contribute to this webinar today. I will share my slides in a moment, so to get started. Can you see them now? Okay, so just a couple of words about my background to understand where I come from what kind of perspective I'm looking at this issue of LXPs and LMSs. I'm a learning designer by profession, and this is what I've done for over 20 years. I started in the end of the 90s in aviation sector, working for online learning development. It was a pioneer effort to create learning opportunities for aviation staff using digital enablers. And we know that those times opportunities were much more limited than they are today. And I have to be honest, I'll be very lucky to see nearly the whole development of online e-learning from the early days until today, which seem even more exciting than ever before, the opportunities we have ahead. So I will give a few introductory slides and share my insights from the design perspective and try to establish ground for Keith to continue and look more into the concept of LXP. This is an image I love to share at times, showing the history of digital learning, how I see it, what has happened over the years, and how it has taken us today until today. So I think the earliest real pioneers of digital learning were the computer-based training initiatives that were done, particularly in the aviation sector, which is familiar to myself. So I'm referring to pilot training, for example, and CD-ROMs and kind of a media discs were used those days to provide simulation courses and tests for pilots. And but when things really started to accelerate was around the change of the millennium, when there were early adopter companies, organizations who really started to look into the possibilities of digital learning and wanted to make benefit. But as it happens oftentimes, is that technology becomes the driver, or things develop from the basis of technology. And that's what happened when LMSs were implemented. And I call it the LMS hype, which actually happened those years. And I was following this development, and I saw many big projects where LMSs were implemented, and those were really big budget experiments and programs that were developed on top of those LMSs. Were big budget experiments where money was never an issue, and people wanted to experiment and see what can happen with these tools and enablers. But the not so happy side of this was that learning was never really in the core of things in these projects. They were too much driven by technology, and what happened then was that the big hopes that were raised for online learning, digital learning, that what it can be, people were let down a bit, and because not so many good outcomes were there. So by year 2007 around, some organizations were able to find good ways of developing digital learning, using LMSs, using customized solutions, which were often actually delivering better results than LMSs. What happened then was the first crisis that has actually positively impacted the development of digital learning in the large scale. Was the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, when everything was more or less stopped. And this hit quite heavily in all learning activity, learning investments. But the positive side of this was that people who were responsible for delivering learning opportunities for staff and so forth had to come up with really solid, sustainable ways of developing digital learning. And they had to come up with ways that were sustainable, cost efficient, and still delivering good results. So I call this phase awakening when people had to really take responsibility of good learning design. Soon after that, mobile learning started to gain traction. And there were many mobile learning experiments. I was part of them a few times, and a lot of lessons were learned. But eventually, this became business as usual for many organizations. Like in Finland, by 2015, most big companies were quite comfortable with developing good learning programs online. They were using these opportunities very well, and it was the prioritized option to deliver staff training programs by doing them online. If you're familiar with this bite-sized learning concept, it refers to micro-learning, micro-credentials, and things like that. It's a design idea or design aspect. It's very good to understand that people started to learning should be delivered online. It's not the same as doing it face-to-face in a physical setting where there's a new structure. Typically, the issue with earlier big implementations was that they tried to bring what was working in real life in the classroom and bring it online and expect that it would happen just like that, and people start learning. It didn't. But that's why bite-sized learning approach emerged. Developing modular structures, developing learning, making it available so that it allows for personalization and choosing what you would actually learn at which time. Conceptual diversification refers to it's based on technological developments. HTML5 emerged around those times in big scale, and new ways of developing content emerged, and new ways of allowing interaction, collaboration online emerged. So a lot of more opportunities were offered to learning developers. And LXPs in really larger scale, I think, started to emerge around when the pandemic started to emerge. I think the pandemic, how sad it is for the world and for people living on Earth, it's still probably the most important single element boosting online learning we've ever seen. The pandemic had impacted over 90% of learning population in the globe. And we know that everything went online just like that. This could have happened many years before, but it didn't, unless we had to do it. And that's the positive side of this. And there's been so many good lessons learned from these past 2-3 years that we've lived through this pandemic. When we think about learning online, teachers didn't have any option than to start engaging their learners online, and they did it. Personally, I believe that now that many more technologies, opportunities become available all the time, design becomes even more important. And we see it already today. We are getting requests from many organizations, more and more organizations, to help them in designing sound learning programs, because people realize that not only technology, not only good content, not only any single aspect can solve the learning challenge. You need to have a thorough approach to learning design, and this is what I'm doing quite a lot these days. I'm trying to change the slide, but nothing is happening now. So, okay, here we go. So, when we look into LMS and LXP, these are two concepts, or let's say technological enablers that are useful for learning online, of course. They more or less attempt to fulfill the same need, but they do it in a different way. And what LMSs have done over the years, they've attempted to create a centralized repository or centralized environment for learners to become and engage in online digital learning. Whereas LXPs look more into personal learning and giving freedom for learner, giving resources, external, internal resources for learners to develop their own learning experience. So we can say that LMS is still more closed systems and LXPs are more open. Roughly defined, LMSs are desktop optimized. Most LMSs that I've seen are not very well compliant for mobile use. There are issues in most platforms. LXPs seem to be a bit better in this regard. The issue of individual learning is quite prominent in LMSs. Of course, there are collaboration and approaches, but still the learning that actually takes place is much more individually engaged than in LXPs. LXPs engage learners in peer activity, in peer assessment, and contributing to creating content in peer teams and so forth. When we look at learning data, LMSs, I would say, traditionally look into the past, what's happened. So how learners have progressed, what they have completed. And this is, of course, it's important for the administration. So say you are responsible for HRD in a big organization, staff learning, you want to know what's happened and what they have done. But does it really serve the needs for future that learning should, in the first place, serve? I'm not so sure. The LXP approach rather looks at what learners actually can already do and what more they should learn to be able to fulfill their aims and objectives of their existence in the organization. Of course, these are not like black and white issues. Both elements can be found in both approaches, depending on what kind of systems you are looking at and so forth, but roughly. So why learning design is then needed for LXP, or actually in any digital learning or learning initiative? Why design is important? Particularly in workplace training context or workplace learning context, the level of or the amount of training programs that actually fail to create impact is high. Depending on source, depending on statistics, it can be anything between 50 and 90%. So think about how much money is invested in workplace training programs, and more than half of them fail to create impact. And so if you invest a lot in a program, any investment that is not carefully designed, aligned to really create impact is like throwing money away. It can even create negative impact in some cases if you develop a poor program that cannot really deliver the results this is a topic I know Keith is eager to talk about more, reinforcement. So we will probably hear more about this in a moment. But actually 90% of what was learned will be lost without reinforcement. So if you just create a content or course without thinking how you can reinforce learning after the learners have taken the course, you are not really getting there. So it's important. LXP's aim to facilitate this approach. Poor design typically and very often means low completion rate if you are developing a course that is not mandatory to complete. There are many cases, MOOCs in particular, which big programs that have a lot of learners there. It can be less than 4% of learners that complete those courses. And the reason is most often poor design. And in most cases, MOOC courses are based on a single or very narrow pedagogical idea, concept. It might be video lesson. So we can ask, is a video lesson added with a couple of questions enough to fulfill a need to actually learn something, learn a skill, or learn to critically think about something? And because of this, we've created frameworks and tools that help learning developers to design ways of interaction, ways of exercises, for example, so that they actually meet the learning need. If you know what the need or objective is, using frameworks such as Bloom's taxonomy, for example, you can actually design a way to reach that goal using certain approaches, design approaches, when you create the course. This is something we developed, we discussed earlier about how technology is driving these initiatives. Still today, most development tools do not incorporate sound design approaches. They are not embedded in these tools. There are exceptions, and we're actually using a couple of very good tools. But generally speaking, the design has to come from the designer, from the developer of the course. I wanted to list some, let's say, most common issues in online courses which need to be addressed, and learning design can address this. Use of inappropriate methods. This means that you use a template, or you use a way that you've used before to develop a course without thinking what kind of methods you would be needed to reach the certain level of learning. Lack of guidance. This is an issue that I would quite critically look at when developing LXPs, because one of the characteristics of LXPs is freedom to learn. So it doesn't mean that you would just let learners decide whatever they want to do with the course, but guidance must be included. Then the question is, what kind of guidance is needed for what kind of learners, or what kind of learning projects or aims? Contextuality is very important, particularly in the case of workplace training. Not so much in academic, where you're more like leaning towards theory. But there's research proving that context, if you can tie your learning initiative in a context, in the actual context of work, context of life, whatever you are going to teach people, that will help them to engage with the course. In the project world, where learning projects are done, it quite easily happens that when the actual development phase is over, people get a little bit tired, and when it's time to implement, then in a way the train slows down, but that's actually the phase when you should accelerate and ensure that implementation is planned well, it's thought through, and on top of that, do good follow-up. LXPs have some really useful tools, approaches that can help in doing the follow-up. So, key considerations when designing LXP. These are questions that I challenge everyone, if you get involved in LXP design, to think hard, think again, and there are no ready answers for this. You have to think about the particular case that you are working on, but questions like, what does freedom to learn mean for your learners? I would come up with a way that you think what is absolutely necessary for your learners to learn, and try to find ways to guide learners to do that in a comfortable way, or in a way that is fit for them. Does learning have to be efficient? That's a tricky question, because like when we are moving towards this open learning idea that basically any resource is available to learners, and learners should be willing or ready to spend their time learning if it's relevant for them. On the other hand, when you look into the workplace learning context and competence requirements, these requirements continue to increase every year. Over 20% of this kind of requirements are increasing all the time, according to statistics. And more compliance is required. This, of course, depends much on what kind of industry you are working on, what kind of learners, in what kind of positions they are working. Anyway, the amount that we have to learn new things is increasing all the time. And it's roughly 50% of what you learn today is useless after a year. So think about it. How to select, how to create virtual learning contexts. This is a design aspect that I'd be happy to talk more if someone is interested. There are many ways to do this, but do it. I mean, that's something you cannot left undone. Establish context for your learners. Use media, use ways to get them connected with the real experience. And technologies like VR and AR have proven very useful for this. We have a very good experience from a program we finished last spring, developing VR-based simulation training for airport staff when they are checking the aircraft between flights. And that was an ideal context for using these methods, because it's as close to a real experience of actually carrying out the task of inspecting an aircraft than you can imagine. By using these technologies that are available to us, I mean, it's not a question of budget or even capabilities of developing. There are easy to use tools that are available to us. How to select appropriate methods of assessment and measurement. LXP is changing this, and Keith will probably tell more about this. But it's important to understand what you are actually measuring when you're measuring learning. And are you measuring what the individual actually masters, skills, competencies, or something that is not so relevant? And finally, how to design the learning experience. Of course, this is like the higher level aspect, but I challenge everyone to look into the ways of designing learning it's a wonderful world of where you can find useful approaches, easy to understand ways that create so much more value for learning programs with quite a little effort. But it has to be a conscious approach that, okay, I take responsibility of designing, developing courses for my learners that they appreciate, that they engage with, and such programs that motivate them to go through and really grab into the challenge of learning. And then they can become more exploratory in their learning efforts, find additional resources and become active learners. But it has to start from somewhere. I would be excited to talk hours about this. This is my most loved topic, but I will hand the microphone over to Keith Quinn and look forward to hearing his thoughts about the actual implementations of LXP and the programs he's done and the many experiences. Thank you for this, and you will have my contact information here. I'll be happy to answer any questions or discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teemu. I think that was extremely comprehensive and wide-ranging and set many things in context. And looking at that wonderful graph you had, looking back over the last 30, 40 years, really puts things in context. But also this need for design, the need to know why we're doing what we're doing, begins to put everything else into perspective. So it's been a very good overview. And as we said, Keith, it's over to you now in Scotland to be able to take us a step further into the dynamic space that is the LXP. So Keith Quinn, you're very welcome.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I'm just going to tee up my slides for folks. Yeah, just as Teemu did, I'll give you a little bit of background. I worked in social services, so human services. That was where I did all my work in digital learning for the last 20-something years. Like Teemu, I've been around since, I think one of the first projects I worked on was to create a CD-ROM using an authoring tool that doesn't even exist anymore, called Macromedia Authorware. I have been creating digital learning resources for an audience of around 650,000 learners over the last few years. So, yeah, I know where all the bear traps are and where the pitfalls are, because I have fallen into many of them over the years. But I'm going to take you through. I want to actually start by going right back to basics. And I know this might be obvious to people, but it's something I always feel I have to emphasize. So there are two ways of looking at learning. One is it's an event. The other one is it's a process. What I've got on screen there, if you remember nothing else that I say this afternoon, please remember this. Clicks and quiz scores do not equal competence. As you'll see when I go through the differences between the implementation on an LMS and an LXP, this is really important because this is what LMSs count. It's clicks, hits, and quiz scores. I take the view that, and I think this kind of thing emphasizes learning as an event. You log in, you do the training, you complete the quiz, and then you sign out, and the learning event is over. I take the view that learning's a process, and all of the learning that I developed over the last 20-something years has been built on this very, very simplified cycle. You acquire new knowledge, you apply it, you reflect on the experience of applying it, what went well, what didn't go well, what might you do differently in future, and then you record that learning experience. And each step in that process serves to reinforce the initial acquisition of new knowledge. So you don't rely on an event where you throw information at people and hope that some of it sticks. You move them through a process where each step reinforces the learning. So that's the backdrop against which my work took place. I think when you ask employers in a corporate world what they want from learning, they can be very clear about what they want, right? So typically it's they want to create training content, they want to deliver courses, they want to administer the whole process, and they want to track people's activity, because what they take is attendance means success. Attendance doesn't mean success, far from it. And there's a really fantastic framework called the Learning Transfer Evaluation Model. And at some point I'll drop the link into the chat so that you can see that, which actually emphasizes that knowing stuff doesn't mean you're competent or you can do new activities. But employers think that's what's important. They want to run reports on training delivery, and they want a one-stop solution and to maintain records. And they assume that that's enough for their employees, that their employees will want more or less the same thing. Well, actually, maybe not quite so much. So what employees want is an easy experience, as little friction as possible. So they want it to be easy to find learning that meets their needs, which might be a common need, but it might not. It might be an individual need. You may have gaps in your capability that you need to fill in. They want to be able to access learning content. And I deliberately didn't use the word course, because learning content might be a video, it might be an audio podcast, it might be an interactive graphic, it could be a whole range of things. Learners really don't care, they just want it to be as accessible as possible. They want to find and access relevant training and learning relevant to their job role right now. You'll see a phrase that if you look across the L&D community internationally, you'll see a phrase which talks about workflow learning. That's what we used to call just-in-time learning, the stuff that you need to know right now in order to complete a task. But they want to record their learning, but they want to record all of their learning. And again, if you look in the kind of L&D press, you'll see stuff that will give you figures for facts that most learning takes place away from formal learning provision. It takes place interacting with peers or socially. It doesn't take place necessarily in a set location or because you've done an online course. So learners want all of that to be recorded, and they want credit for it all. They want it to be recognized. We had to deal with many workers who would get frustrated by having to go through the same training again and again and again every time they move from one employer to another. And our way to get around that was to create national micro-credentials for the sector, that they could show the employer and say, there, I have done this, and here's the evidence. But they also want help. They want help to identify what they should do next to progress to their next job. Employers tend not to be so concerned about their next job. Employees definitely are, and it's a big issue for them. So in terms of LMSs and LXPs, what does that mean? Well, LMSs administer training. Timo did a great job telling you about the LMS and how it emerged. LXPs, they also administer training, and they can administer training, but they also deliver content and they can enable discovery. And it's this thing about discovery learning. We had an experience, but I could spend a whole afternoon talking to you about open badges. But our open badges were micro-credentials that people got for completing our training resources. And what we began to find was that people were discovering new learning when they went to claim a badge for a bit of learning they'd already done. They'd be there putting in their evidence and getting their badge awarded, and then they would see something else on the platform that they'd never seen before. and they would follow the link back to the original training resource or learning resource, and they would embark on a bit of learning they hadn't planned to do, but they discovered it on that platform. So LXPs are good at discovery learning. LMS's catalog, store, monitor and schedule, all that kind of stuff about administration. LXPs usually seek to give you a consumer grade user experience. They try to make it as attractive to engage with as possible and try and make it function in a way that is similar to online services that people are using outside of the learning world. You'll see things on LXPs like that will make recommendations based on what you've already learned. It's a bit like the Amazon recommendation thing. People who read this also read that. You'll see some of that on LXPs, where people who learned this or took this program also went on and did this one. But there is opportunity for social learning and social connection, so you can do peer-to-peer communication on LXPs. So content is obviously, learning content is a big deal, and both LMSs and LXPs do things like deliver learning materials. You can do compliance and onboarding. You can do courses if staff have really got time for courses. I used to do a presentation to groups of managers where I would highlight for them that the average amount of time that a learner has in any corporate world, any corporate environment, is 20 minutes per week. And in the sector I worked in, the people services sector, the feedback I got was it was more like 10 minutes a week. So are you really going to get people to sit down in front of 50 slides and work through them all and then do a quiz in 20 minutes? Because if you are, they're not learning a thing. They're skipping through and putting random answers into the quiz and then hoping that they pass. Instructional videos are another content type, and you can make them a lean forward experience or a lean back. So lean back is switch it on and just let it play. Lean forward is make it interactive. And you can make it interactive either so you can interact directly with the video, or you can make it interactive by using things like serialized, dramatized scenarios with tasks in between each episode, as my former colleagues have just released. So LXPs can do all of that, and they tend to be much more interactive, and they are definitely much more skills focused rather than knowledge transfer. And they can accommodate user-generated content. You'll often see things where people will say that, by informing a colleague and helping a colleague understand a bit of learning, it actually reinforced their own. So user-generated content should not be ignored. It can be really important and it can be really helpful. Here's the thing about peer-based learning. There is an academic at Harvard whose name has just gone right out of my head, who described an experience where he was trying to teach elementary physics in university. And he found that because he's a PhD physicist, if people struggled to understand the basic concepts, he'd moved way beyond the point where he can understand what was going wrong for their understanding. And he couldn't translate things to the level that they needed. And his solution was to get a peer of the student who did understand the concept to explain it in terms that the person who didn't would. That's why you don't ignore user-generated content. It can be really, really helpful. And it gets past that thing that experts are actually too expert and they can't dial back the level that they're teaching at. The strengths of an LMS is clearly administration, and some types of assessment really I've got constrained there because it tends to have it tends to be quiz-based, and quiz questions, multiple choice questions can be good for reinforcing learning, but they're not good at identifying that anybody's learned anything at all. If you recognize a term in a quiz, data protection is a great one, where, you'll see a term and, But do you understand what that means? Well, I recognise it. Well, that doesn't mean you understand it. It doesn't mean you can do anything with it. So assessment, yeah, some. And the certification tends to be around, you have completed this course, now print out your certificate that you've been here. That's not how we operated, and it was because we just thought it was pointless. And actually what we found was learners didn't value it because they put no effort in. If you want to certificate people for doing things, they need to make an effort. They need to feel like they've earned it. And LMSs are good for control. LXPs are better at content creation. They're more flexible. You can personalize your learning journeys, and there's more variety. Best and reason for using one is their XAPI, which is Experience API and Learning Record Store driven. And I'll go on to talk a bit about what that means in just a moment. The weaknesses of an LMS, they're scoring driven. I'm sure everybody's using authoring tools that push out scoring packages. You could do what a scoring package does with a notebook and pencil, because it takes attendance and it counts things. That's basically a scoring package. They are not so good at flexibility, and they're not good at variety. LXPs by design are not good at control, because it's that thing about you're trying to encourage discovery learning and social learning. So they tend to kind of focus less on control. So here's a description of the differences between SCORM and Experience API. XAPI, sessionless communication. So it means you don't have to be online the whole time. SCORM requires you to have a constant internet connection. And XAPI learning content can be literally anywhere. It can be anything, anywhere. Content on a SCORM-based system has to be housed in an LMS. And you can only track pass or fail, post-test, score completion, that kind of thing. And it only tracks formal e-learning courses. XAPI, on the other hand, tracks a wide variety of learning experiences. And I actually built a system that ran from a smartphone that allowed people to capture learning anywhere it took place, at any time, day or night. And it was the most successful product we ever launched to that big audience I'm talking to you about. In fact, it was so successful on the day it was launched, we thought our servers were under attack. We thought we were experiencing a denial of service attack, and we almost shut down the server to protect it. And then we noticed what it was people creating new accounts, and they were creating new accounts at the rate of, kind of 3 a second. It was just unbelievable what happened. XAPI can also track informal self-guided learning. So the key differences are the 4 that I've just highlighted. In a corporate world, you're interested in the learning process, you're interested in skill development and skill improvement. SCORM-based systems are simply not very good at tracking that and enabling that. XAPI-based systems are. So I would say, if you're building for the future, don't build SCORM, build XAPI, because it's going to take you further in that kind of lifelong learning, continuous professional development model. If you want to know more about XAPI, the address is at the bottom of that slide. It's basically just, if you go into a browser and type in xapi.com, it'll take you here. It's an open standard. It's not owned by anybody. And there's actually a really good free program to help you build skills in using XAPI called the XAPI cohort. And the address for that is XAPI cohort, all one word.com. Again, when I've finished doing the slides, I'll dig out that address and share it with you. But you can embed XAPI statements in almost everything that you produce, including videos. And there's some wonderful resources that are free to use that will give you a customizable code that you can use in your own project, so you don't have to start with a blank screen. lots and lots of wonderful resources that will help you enable your learning materials with XAPI. But that's the place to go and get more information about what it is and how it works and what the potential is. So XAPI is short for the Experience API, and LRS is a learning record store. And it's a repository. It's basically a database where people's records of their learning are stored. It goes in there and it is held in an account for each individual learner. And XAPI is the communication channel between the learner and the LRS. So anything that the learner defines as learning can be stored in the LRS, and XAPI is the wiring that makes that happen. So, you know, it's predicated on the basis that people learn from interactions with, not just with learning content, but other people and on-the-job experiences. And these actions happen all over the place, not just online, but offline as well. And all of these actions can be recorded with XAPI. And when it's recorded, the application that you're using sends a secure statement, which is basically constructed with a noun, a verb, and a subject. So, I did this to the learning record store. And the record of your learning records all the statements from multiple data sources, wherever you've interacted and signed into your learning account. So it's LMSs, simulators, videos, ebooks. We had people who were using employers who were using LMSs saying, can we connect with your learning record store? So we built APIs to help them send their learning data to our learning record store in the name of their employee. So these systems, I usually describe it as an ecosystem of services and technologies rather than one centralized platform. And that's the big difference. So you can take your pick. There are any number of LXPs available on the market, and they are appearing at, you know, a rate of knots. And you know, those are the first dozen that I came across. So, you know, lots and lots of material out there. I could talk for hours about how you incentivize learning using micro-credentials and how to tie micro-credentials into an LXP and have everything, all the learning content, all the micro-credentials, all of these records on an LXP, all connect up using XAPI in a learning record store, which the learning account can follow the employee throughout their life, never mind their career just in one employer, but it can follow them for life. And that's a huge deal because, as Timu said in his session, what you learn today is by and large irrelevant very soon afterwards. So this whole thing about building a learning environment where people are consistently and consciously and regularly engaging with learning is really, really important. So if you're in any doubt about why we shouldn't just count stuff, I love this quote. I'm not sure if it really was Albert Einstein that said this, but it's attributed to him. And I think it's just wonderful. You know, everything that can be counted does not necessarily count. It doesn't matter. But everything that counts, similarly, cannot easily be counted. I think that's a wonderful way to look at it, because there is no doubt that assessment and accounting for learning in an XAPI-based world and an LXP is going to take more effort. And so it should, because learning is effortful. You know, we try to pretend that you can sit in front of some slides and you will learn something. You can't. And I'm weary of, I see things in the learning development community that label themselves a TikTok learning experience. TikTok's not a learning experience. You can't learn something in 90 seconds. You can be reminded and you can be prompted and you can reinforce learning in 90 seconds, but you're not going to acquire a new skill in 90 seconds. Learning takes effort. And we should disabuse learners of the fact that, you know, you can do it in 90 seconds by building things that look like TikTok for learning. We really shouldn't. So like Timu, I mean, I could talk for hours, and I usually get really enthusiastic and carried away myself. So I'm going to stop there. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have as far as I can. And I'll just hand back to Alan.
Well, Keith, thank you very, very much. I think this is a masterful overview. It really builds on very well from the points that Teemu was raising earlier, but you've taken us through this wonderful juxtaposition of two different worlds. And interesting, as you've been doing this, I've been able to go through the questions that have been coming up, and you have anticipated a lot of the issues in that contrast, okay, between technology and meaning. Just the last point first, I really think that quote from Einstein is wonderful, you know, but what counts and what's counted. And there's a certain, I think, precise richness in what he's saying. I'm reminded of one of our own Irish writers, Oscar Wilde, who said, too many people know the price of everything but the value of nothing. And I think that this is the idea. We're talking about value. The other word you kept using was the question of environment. And I think this idea of understanding the environment is having that holistic approach to things where things begin to fit in and make sense, and we can begin to record them and look at them. Now, I have, as you've been talking, I have been going through all these things coming in and trying to make sense of them. We have quite a few questions, and I'm very grateful for our participants who've been able to feed them through. I am going to try and pick out some of them and then cast them over to you and to Teemu for comment and for observation. We have about half an hour left, and if we don't get to the end of everything, apologies to everybody, but I think if I know anything, Keith, I think you've opened a Pandora's box of ideas and issues and debates, and this is exactly the time that we need to be holding this discussion. So let me go back over here. There's one lovely coming in here, going back to some of the comments we have from people. There was here. I want to start with this one from Engineer Rayed. Can you explain more about clicks and hits and quiz score does not equal competence? It was a lovely point, but maybe just to expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, I used to have big debates with the data people in my organization because they wanted to count visits. and they thought that visits meant something was successful. Or they would think that downloads were a measure of success. So if you only had one download of a resource, it wasn't successful. And so what, I mean, the reason for that whole statement is SCORM basically counts how many clicks you do when you're watching or when you're using a learning resource, a slide-based learning resource. So every time you hit next, every time you click next, or you use one of these drag and drop activities, SCORM counts that. And it counts page visits, you know, so if there's 50 slides in a course and you only clicked on 30 of them, then you never finished the course. But the data people, the analysts in our organization thought that that was a measure of success. And I used to point out that it wasn't. I mean, it just meant you were present. I once evaluated a piece of learning like that for another organization, and I said to them, you know, I never read a single slide and I got 95% in the quiz. And they said to me, oh, that's great, you passed the quiz. I said, no, you haven't listened. I didn't read a thing. And I put random answers into the multiple choice questions and I still passed. I'm trying to point out you've got a bad design. You need to go back and redesign. Because if you take that score as my level of competence, I haven't got a clue what I was supposed to be reading because I never read it. I just wanted to see what would happen if I just put random answers in. So the quiz score thing, though, that's often used as a measure of how much you have learned. It doesn't show you that at all, because it's only showing you one part of the process. It shows you how much information you've absorbed or you've been able to recognize. The second link that I shared, the second and third links that I shared in the chat are to the learning transfer evaluation model. The last one I put up there is a graphic just showing you the table of the different levels in that model. And you'll see that knowing stuff is right at the bottom. Being able to recognize stuff is right at the bottom. And actual competence, how to measure competence, is right up at the top. It's levels 5, 6, and 7. Way beyond just kind of clicking through something and having a quiz score. A quiz score that says you've passed just means you're good at doing multiple choice questionnaires. Doesn't really mean you've learned anything. It might just mean you've got a really good short-term memory. I happen to have a very good short-term memory. I mean, I'll only remember it tomorrow, but I'll certainly remember it enough at the time. So that's what that thing was about. It's like, don't look at superficial statistics and assume that that means somebody's competent in a role. I would never want to be operated on by a surgeon who'd passed a quiz. And I certainly wouldn't like to be in an airplane being flown somewhere by a pilot that's only had 50 slides in a quiz. I'd be getting off the plane pretty sharpish. So competence is about more than just understanding, and it's about way more than just knowledge transfer. It's about the application of all of that and learning from that application. The application of learning being part of the process of learning itself and not an outcome or not just a measure. It's looking at application of learning as being an integral part of the experience. And you're not going to get that by counting quiz scores. That's why I showed that next part of that slide was the acquire, apply, reflect, record cycle, and kind of trying to emphasize learning is all of that. And I could have taken each one of these 4 stages and broken it down even further for you, but I didn't want to. I could rattle on for days about this stuff, and about why that recognizing the whole cycle is important. But I'm going to stop there. Hope that answers the question.
Keith, I have can I intervene a bit, because you're touching a really important point here, and I fully agree with you. And I have good news, at least in that part of the world where I come from. Airport staff and pilots are trained by using many other ways of tracking their competencies than just those simple questions. And this is a concrete example where learning design comes into play, and that's true. I mean, LMSs and the tools we used earlier didn't allow us to track learning, really. So we had to come up with ways of doing it. And I mean, it's nearly 20 years ago when I developed my first learning simulation, which was a scenario-based simulation. And these same simulations are used to actually track learning, not only to provide the learning experience or drills for learners to practice something, but they can actually be used to track how well they master a process or skill. And it's not only limited to, let's say, hands-on skills or something so concrete, but also for social skills, communication skills, leadership skills. We have very good results in doing this. But this is where learning design is needed, because you'd actually have to create these elements in the course when the technology is not there yet to provide these opportunities.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Tamer, before you came in, there has been a question from Mohammed Al-Khudair, and he was actually building on this image Keith gave us of the pilot trained over 50 slides. He said, does LXP help when employing it in logistics and transportation industry? How could it be helpful to the delivery associates as they take the training individually, while LXP is a peer activity? So I think what you're talking about, again, is a really good concrete example that goes back to those issues around design and development.
Absolutely. I mean, and because there's social learning built in, or the opportunity for social learning built in, doesn't mean that you won't spend some time learning something on your own. So you can still do individual learning. You can still consume learning content as an individual. It's just that the LXP opens up channels of other types of learning experience, so you can build on that individual experience and take it further. And it really doesn't matter what industry you're in. It's kind of industry agnostic. I mean, it would work as well in logistics as it would in healthcare or in school education, teacher training. It doesn't really kind of matter what industry you're in. It's Temu's really important point. It's about the design of learning experiences that's really important. I always see these things as it's a tool. It's like a chalkboard or a notebook and pencil or a laptop. They're just tools. People used to say to me, what authoring tools do you use? And I said, well, I rarely and almost never use a tool that's called an authoring tool. I use bits of software to help me create learning assets. And it might be something as simple as, I use Keynote for presentations, but I also use Keynote for doing motion graphics and instructional videos and screen capture videos, so it can be anything. The tool is almost irrelevant. It's Temu's point about what's really important here is learning experience design and thinking about that cycle, that whole cycle. How am I going to move everybody around that acquire, apply, reflect, record cycle? Because that's how I'm going to embed the learning. And yes, I can push out things like, there's a wonderful tool called Sparks that was built by a fellow Scot who currently lives in Canada. And the whole raison d'etre of Sparks is to do the thing about pushing out reminders. It's about, kind of reinforcing learning, and it's doing it using things like text messages on mobile phones, and things like I don't know if you've used Slack, but using those kind of collaborative working tools, and just text messaging, saying and actually pre-building that. And so when somebody completes a bit of learning, they start to get a series of these texts at set intervals that act to reinforce the learning. Because one of the bits that was that Temu mentioned was about how much learning is lost if you don't reinforce it. Tools like Sparks do that, but you won't find tools like that in every LXP. And that's why, in my work, what we did was we looked at that whole ecosystem of services and technologies, rather than try to find, that kind of one platform that rules everything. Instead of having a platform in the middle, put the learner in the middle and let the technologies dance around the learner, rather than learners trying to be forced into the way that one particular platform wants to do things. It might be good for learners, it might not. Look at the capabilities of LXPs and say, right, what works for me and what doesn't? Is there another way of getting access to those technologies? You might not need a platform. You might want to go down the road I went, which was create this ecosystem. But even, in saying that, part of that ecosystem in our vision was to have an LXP at some point, because one of the great things that they do, and they do it really well, is, you're able to build career pathways for people in your organization. And that might be somebody in logistics, or it might be somebody in my world, the human services, but you can create career pathways and then attach learning assets to that pathway, so people can start to do the thing about, how do I get to my next promotion? How do I get to my next job? and they're also excellent at curating stuff. You know, why reinvent stuff that's really good and it's already out there? Timu mentioned stuff that he's doing around leadership skills. Why would I rewrite that if Timu's already got a really good program, but I can curate it? And I can say, I could put it on that platform and say, you should have a look at this for leadership because, and then give them reasons why it's valid, reliable, trustworthy, and useful.
Okay, thank you very much. I think these are very comprehensive responses, and it's created a lot of dialogue, some very good comments coming in on the questions and answers. Now, we only have another few minutes, so I've tried to go through and look at a couple of key short questions, which I'd like your quick comments on. One of the questions that came up here was the question, do you see LMS as a fit for education sector and LXP for the corporate sector? Briefly, Teemu, would you have any comment on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's the problem with these concepts of LXP and LMS that they don't, any of these alone will not fulfill the task, as Keith just mentioned. So it's impossible to answer that question, and actually with LMSs, I think I've done nearly 500 learning programs over the years, and I would say a small fraction of them have been delivered through an LMS. We had to come up with bespoke systems, custom follow-up systems. We actually built our own system to only do what was required to manage these courses. So I would look into this idea of ecosystem and what kind of tools and systems you need, and try to rather build something small first and see how it works, and then extend it. And there was also a question about open source LXP solutions. I can see some of these concepts emerging, but I think you would have to be building your own way anyway of doing this. There are some really good systems in the market, commercial solutions, and the positive side of this is that often they take them to the desired result faster and with less effort, also considering that the budgets than open source solutions, which may require you to really put effort, work time into developing a system that fulfills your need, and still it may not be perfect for that purpose. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but it's not really a simple question.
Yeah, it's quite complicated because it depends on the type and the kind of philosophy of the educational establishment. I mean, you know, so you have some higher education institutions who are quite happy with LMS, thanks very much, because they're only interested in the student while they're a student. But on the other hand, you have other higher education institutions who want to reach beyond that undergraduate level and follow the person through a career. So they're going to be more interested.
And we have another situation, which is higher education globally is itself going through a profound transformation about its rationale, its purpose, it's the extent of commodification. I'm very happy to say that we will be coming in the second session of this series of this webinar to talk about higher education, and we will go into this in more depth. Very quick question came from Sarah. Coursera, could it be considered an LMS or an LXP?
Who wants to start?
That could probably take us, and we only have a few more minutes.
Yeah, it's a MOOC platform, which is kind of it's a massive online open course platform, and I've spent quite a bit of time with these systems recently. We did a big project for Finnish universities using the MOOC approach, and to be able to reach the goal of the project established by the principals of these universities, required us to build a custom system because none of the existing MOOC platforms didn't fulfill the requirement that was set. And I think talking about Coursera, the problem is that the concept is quite narrow in terms of methodology, and it's you cannot change it. So it's based on this traditional way of lecturer giving a lecture, and then you are testing what they memorize and what the learners memorize and so forth. So it's but that kind of system. It may work for some purpose, but not necessarily for some other.
Yeah, I think the big health warning with MOOCs is they are not for people who haven't had an education experience beyond school. They just don't work. The dropout rates are massive. They're massive because people can't quite engage with the model. The best MOOCs I've seen have been ones where every participant already had an advanced degree and was already self-sufficient as a learner. They were never designed, they were never conceived of as a solution for mass education at undergraduate level. If you talk to Stephen Downes, who along with George Siemens created the first MOOC on connectivism, he'll tell you that. They were never conceived of as for mass education. So the answer is they're not an LXP or an LMS. Timu hit the nail on the head. They're a MOOC platform.
I think the point with MOOCs, the quite rare examples of really successful MOOCs are because of a strong person brand that's as a lecturer. So if you can, that's itself, it's interesting to people. So they want to see someone really credible to give insights and engage in that. So the motivation has to be there already when you go into that course. But learning design starts from the point that we don't expect that any of the learners have motivation when they start learning. It's our responsibility to spark it, and we can do it using these tested methods.
There are many other comments in the questions that have come up, wide-ranging ones, and people are talking things like universal access. Sarah has brought up the question of more attention, Naif Alanesi, the question of more time to look at e-learning itself and developing this. These are wonderful. One person writing in about their own study program in the future. So I hope that today's session has been able to stimulate that thinking and debate. One final question, just for each of you, very, very briefly, because I think it may sum up a lot of where we're at in our concluding moments here. John Hinchcliffe writes, what roles do you see as now being needed within an L&D team to meet the evolving functions and ways of providing learning through an LXP? The people who are actually running, administering, involved in this, if the issues that you both highlighted are real, and they are, what different kinds of roles are we going to be looking at? Can I ask you to do this in 1 minute each?
I'll give you a quick list. You need somebody whose job focus is curation. It's a full-time job. Absolutely. You need people there who've got a qualification and experience in digital learning design. Here's the kicker. Check the nature of the program they did. If it was run by a computer science team, don't. If it was run by an education department or function within higher, yes, that's the one to go for. Computer science departments running digital learning design courses tend to focus on the technology and not the learning process. And that's where some of the myths about things like learning styles get perpetuated. So I would say watch that. I would suggest that you need somebody like a videographer, and you need folk with really good technical skills if you're going to build out an ecosystem. I was fortunate. I had somebody who was able to build a whole badge platform from the ground up, you know, and it can save you huge amounts of money. Because following on for Timu's point, open source doesn't always equal free. You are often cheaper and quicker to go with an off-the-shelf system. So anyway,
thank you, Keith. That's your minute. Teemu, anything to add to
No,
that?
yeah, not much to add to that, Keith. I would just like to emphasize from our experience that it definitely makes sense, particularly if you're in a bigger organizations, to build this expertise in-house. It's something that we're going to see more and more in bigger organizations. Learning design skills are becoming mandatory skills in every workplace. They're like media literacy skills. That's how I see the future. But on top of that, find good subcontractors, partners who can deliver you and work with you
Great.
in these projects.
Thank you both. We now come to the end of this session, this webinar. I would like to express my thanks to my colleagues, my friends that I've worked with over many years, both experts, Teemu Patala in Finland, Keith Quinn in Scotland. And on my own behalf, I'd like to express my thanks to NELC for hosting this. And I'd like to thank all of you who've been participating with these wonderful questions and observations. And hopefully this is a topic which we can develop and extend in the future. Zaid, over to you for the final remarks. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce. We would like to invite our participants to join us on the second session. Please follow us on Twitter to receive the latest updates in our future webinars. Stay tuned. A link to the webinar survey has been provided in the chat. We kindly ask the participants to complete it within 10 minutes after the end of the session. On behalf of the National E-Learning Center, we thank our distinguished host, Dr. Alan Bruce, for leading this interactive and informative webinar on Learning Experience Platform, LXP, or Learning Management System, LMS, features and challenges. We would also like to thank the esteemed panelists, Dr. Teemu Patala and Mr. Keith Quinn, for their valuable input, and the participants for attending this webinar. Until next time, I'm Zaid Al-Ghaib. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.